Hello and welcome to another episode of the In the Trenches podcast. I'm your host, Cal Davenport. I'm here with my co-host, Seth Root. Welcome, Seth.
Hey, Cal.
Today we've got James M Patterson. He's an associate professor of politics at Ave Maria University, the president of the Ciceronian Society, a research fellow at the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy, the author of Religion in the Public Square, Sheen King Falwell. And he's also written an article at Law and Liberty that we're going to talk about today. And that is entitled, "The Time to Fund New Universities is Now." Dr. Patterson, thank you so much for being on In the Trenches.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. I'm glad to be here.
Now, before we get into your argument in detail, can you tell us, just to begin, tell us a little bit about the problem that funding new universities is intended to solve, and how did universities get so bad?
So this is a long-standing complaint among people on the right. Generally, there's been a leftward leaning in the university, starting from the post-war years, maybe a little preceded by the war. Sort of depends on what you mean by left. But in earnest, things changed in the post-war years, post-Second World War years, because of the intervention of the federal government into higher education, as well as a change in the elites that operated the universities and what they thought higher education was for. For a very long time, higher education in places like the Ivy League was intended for a certain class of people that understood themselves self-consciously to be part of the American aristocracy, generally understood to be the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But in the years after the Second World War, these kinds of ideas were very passé, and in many cases, this is to be welcomed because it meant the end of all kinds of discrimination against very capable people from entering into the university. But the leftward lurch comes in with the movement towards a meritocracy that was also supposed to be promoting secular reason and technology, and had a greater attachment to government funding. And over time, what this led to was a kind of managerial elite, as it's sometimes called, becoming responsible for developing classes. And there was a conservative classes, meaning class of the year of 1952 and class of the year 1953, people responsible for admissions. And over time, there was a conservative backlash against what they saw as, at least conservatives like William F. Buckley Jr., as they saw an abandonment of teaching the best that's been thought and said at these universities in favor of a kind of technocratic secular reason. And he wanted to excoriate his alma mater, Yale, for failing to do the proper justice to a historical tradition of Western thought. And he writes this in God and Man in Yale, comes out in 1951. And so what you begin to see during this period is a kind of a counter elite of people on the right who wanted to exercise greater control over the universities they had attended. And this ongoing effort produces terms like the tenured radical, who is a kind of bête noire for the sort of countercultural right among elites in American universities, where the person who was responsible for so much of the leftward lurch were these sort of Chablis drinking, latte guzzling, effetes who did very little in the way of original research, and but did a great deal in the way of subverting the character of the youth that they taught. And so you actually can find there's books on tenured radicals. And it's not that they didn't exist, it's that they didn't exist nearly in the number that was often thought, because what was actually happening at a lot of these universities was the transfer of authority from the faculty toward administrators. And the idea was that the faculty would have to do less actual governing of the university. The administrators could do more. And that means the faculty could actually do more research or raise more grant money or whatever it is that would make them more productive. And so the university sort of the university, as conservatives have understood it, never really ever quite existed in the way that they had imagined, where the tenured radicals are subverting the institutions and the students. And so the problem is both one of a real historical change, the one that Buckley first noted, and the other is a misdiagnosis of how the problem of the universities has taken shape. It's not really a problem of tenured radicals. It's more of a problem of managerial control of an administrative elite that are usually responding to actual student pressures, as well as to legal pressures from the federal and to a lesser extent from state governments.
So just to put a finer point on this, it's not necessary. You're not necessarily saying that the universities haven't abandoned a more conservative approach or lurched leftward, but it's not so much because of the faculty. It's because either the administrators see things that way or they are responding to student pressures to move things in that direction. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I probably could have made that shorter, but there's a lot of ground to cover there, and that is really the rub. Is that the transformation, the ideological transformation of the universities has in fact taken place. It's in fact almost done. It's almost completed. But the agents responsible are not the tenured radicals and the faculty, who are often responding to incentives or directly, and their hires are directly related to an administrative intervention in the hiring process. So yeah, it's both administrative led, and the administrators in many cases are responding to students that are attending their college.
Well, this is fascinating too, because I think I see from something that you mentioned about the focus that the faculty can place on research and bringing in grant money and that sort of thing. It seems like there's a sort of a business incentive behind some of the moves that the administration, the administrative departments have made at these schools. And I wonder, is that also, do you see that as responsible for a shift maybe away from a focus on teaching and imparting things to the next generation, to the students, and more toward things that, again, bring in the university more funding, more support?
Well, the point that you're making is actually a very important one, because I find that the very peculiar nature of American higher education makes it hard for people to relate to it. And so the expectation is that the principal job of a university professor will be to teach. And that is only true at some places. That would be what we would call a liberal arts college. And at a liberal arts college, you typically don't have advanced degrees or a strong emphasis on research, although that's less the case now. Sometimes you'll find some graduate programs at liberal arts colleges, and it's very difficult to escape the pressure to produce some kind of publication and show engagement in a discipline. So if you're attending a state university, especially a state university that's considered a flagship, so the University of Texas or the University of Oregon or the Ohio State University, these universities entirely prioritize publications and grant writing because there is a desire for the university to trade in prestige, since student alumni largely are taken for granted, and the education is largely the product of a combination of full-time faculty lectures, students, graduate students grading, and some of the core classes usually picked up by adjunct or some other form of contingent faculty. And so the idea that there is a full-time professor at a state school or at an elite private school who's responsible for managing the entire class is entirely a fiction. That's not what happens.
Dr. Patterson, one of the things we wanted to ask you was, in your piece, you talk about some of the most common strategies that conservatives have employed to counter the problems of higher education in the past. One is to counterattack with defenses of a shared canon representing Western civilization for students. The other is to rely on, more free market principles to kind of beat out the outmoded brick and mortar college with less wasteful programs focused on skilled trades. Um, and it seems like you're saying those are not enough. That the situation we're in, the circumstances and the situation we're in now, um, we need new thinking, so to speak. Tell us why these are not good enough for today's world we live in.
So the original author of the counterattack approach, wherein conservative higher educational elites would mount an effort to take institutions back and repurpose them or redirect them towards sort of traditional academic learning in the forms of, the Tridium or some form of liberal arts curriculum. That began with Buckley, and that effort has more or less not succeeded. And a big reason for this has to do with something that I didn't have room to describe in the piece, but I allude to, and the understanding of funding. So when people donated money to universities for the purposes of teaching what they saw as a more conservative curriculum, universities could often take that money and, at least by the letter of intent, direct that funding and that toward that intended end, but ordinarily toward faculty who weren't so interested in the original purpose for the grant. And at the same time, they're taking in grant money for directly contrary purposes towards a more technocratic secular approach to education. And so that money, the latter money for technocratic secular reason, usually swamped or overwhelmed conservative money. And so the effort to sponsor a counterattack in the university lost because of not having a sufficient amount of firepower. And the ensuing consequence was that faculty hiring of conservatives became increasingly difficult to the point where you might end up with a single sort of outsized personality and fundraiser who could kind of corner the market at the college for some kind of ideological diversity, and then maybe stage a kind of defensive campaign for their ground at the university. The only exception to this, at least when we're talking about top tier elite universities, is Professor Robbie George at Princeton University, whose James Madison program, which I was a postdoctoral fellow at, has really like a campus presence. But the other universities of that caliber, or maybe a tier below, simply have really suffered from an effort to keep the counterattack going. And this is primarily because there's nothing to stop the competition from overwhelming conservative ventures to prevent the continued development of universities towards a more technocratic approach. The alternative imagined, I would say, like towards the end of the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010s, was the MOOC, or the massively open online course, with the hope that these courses, because they could scale so easily by using internet technology, might displace the credentializing function of universities, and as a result, simply gut the marketplace of the advantages they had in a monopoly, a sort of a market-wide monopoly of universities on credentializing elites. And there were a few problems with this, specifically the targets for the people to receive these certifications were usually the people who benefited the least from MOOCs. So if you had people that were relatively less well advantaged financially and did not have as much experience in attending higher education, maybe they're first generation students, they usually needed a lot of help from mentors at a university to guide them through the process. And that's precisely what MOOCs do not offer. And what made them a sort of market function in the eyes of a lot of economists was that they would not need that kind of support, that they could kind of plan their own progress. But the completion rate of these courses was so low that eventually all of the companies built around MOOCs as a way of doing things like Udacity, they all closed their doors or moved into different markets like corporate training. And so the rationale behind this approach is essentially to use a business model to supplant the certification process. And on campus, where you see campuses try to adopt this approach, you often find administrators that are using sort of MBA techniques of trying to gauge where student demand is, and then focusing on that demand. An example of this would be the University of Tulsa, which turned upside down a rather excellent liberal arts curriculum in favor of focusing on international entrepreneurship and social justice. There were massive protests by students on campus. It's one of the examples when they anticipated a student demand that wasn't there. And the result was the gutting of a traditional school. Another place where this almost happened, has kind of stopped happening, was Mount St. Mary's, where they tried to undermine the Catholic identity of the university by turning it into another sort of like a business-driven marketplace for student demand. So the thing about these two approaches is that there's some doubt about whether they'll succeed. And the piece, I just leave the issue about whether they'll succeed to the side. As you can probably tell from my descriptions, I'm skeptical of both. But the worst thing for either strategy is to try to pursue them at the same time. And on the right, we've seen both attempted at the same time. And it has had the predictable results, which is that neither has really succeeded. And if they were ever going to succeed, they certainly couldn't succeed together. And so what I say as an alternative is to focus on existing institutions that already suit the needs of conservatives and to fund them.
On that subject, recently, like in 2016, Arizona, gave $7 million to, support an initiative that would get universities such as Arizona State to start programs and to kind of defend Western civilization and take kind of statesmanship seriously. I was wondering, what do you think of that avenue of state legislatures just giving money to these state colleges and universities, but stipulating that they actually have a program of maybe not of James Madison's program, but something like that, to where we can kind of fight back, so to speak. Is that something that have you thought about, and what are the pitfalls for that type of thinking?
That's a good point, because that would be a state legislature engaging in a counterattack strategy under the auspices of the very things they're supposed to consider. And to in a similar way, we've seen state legislatures attempt to curb the curriculum on what's called critical race theory. And in either case, what matters the most is the understanding that the move from the legislation as it's passed to enforcement at the university level is actually rather treacherous. So leaving out the CRT issue, it's just an example of how states are now increasingly interested in higher educational governance. When it comes to the Arizona case, really the primary issue to consider, and I actually don't know enough about the grant itself, who's administering the grant, who's been hired for the purposes of teaching it, and what, if any, research or curriculum is it supporting. If those questions are not immediately answerable, then there is a very good chance for university administrative capture of those legally stipulated requirements, and a redirection them towards the interests that the administration has, rather than towards the intentions of the legislature. So I don't know the particulars of that reform, but that would be the concern I'd have if I were a member of the legislature, and seeing this legislation play out over the course of the next few years.
So how does your vision that you lay out in your piece, how does that contrast with what we see the legislature in Arizona doing? And then what what would an institution that is funded and put together in the way that you described, what would it look like? How would it be similar and different to what's already out there?
So what's interesting is that I just called my piece interesting, so I should be careful. No, what's fun about the piece is that what I'm describing about funding new universities used to be something that Americans did all the time. So it was not uncommon for people to start new universities. It's somewhat uncommon now to uncommon. I mean, I'm at a university that was founded in 2003, originally in Michigan. Ave Maria moved down to Florida, I think in 2007. It was before I started working here. So this place is pretty new, but it's unusual for being new. But if you think about some universities founded at the beginning of the 20th century and look at where they are now, it's kind of amazing. Things like the University of Chicago and Johns Hopkins, these are now elite universities that serve a vital part in the development of new technologies and training students for elite positions. And so it's very possible for universities could be founded to serve this purpose. And so what I describe is sort of inspired by that previous generation of very wealthy Americans who understood their wealth to be part of a public trust for investing in the nation. It's harder to find people that necessarily feel that way, or if you do find them, they often don't quite know what to do because they've been there are a lot of people who are very interested in spending their money. And so they're very reluctant to engage in these kinds of ventures without a lot of assurances. And so I spend a fair amount of my piece when describing the alternative, providing some review of those who have been trying to think about this question, like Frederick Hudson, Brendan Bell, and the National Affairs magazine published a piece called An Ivory Tower of Our Own. And they blue skying the best possible elite university to build over the course of a few years. They think it would cost $3 billion. But in their mentality, what they're saying is, this is if you're starting with nothing. And this is actually the amount of capital that was slowly amassed over the course of time for places like Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago. But really, in my view, it wouldn't be that necessary. After all, Rockefeller was able to get it started pretty cheaply versus what they expected. And the motivation to pursue excellence at the University of Chicago really took care of itself after that. Just required an initial startup cost, and then people started to be motivated to attend very quickly when they saw that it was a university that was going to be pursuing an agenda that was consistent with what they believed was the right thing to learn. So I think at one point I go over the work of Jacob Holand, that it would cost maybe $500 million. And this is really referring to a university that has everything you need to attend. So if you want to be an engineer, you would have access to engineering facilities. And there exists today a lot of small liberal arts colleges that are self-consciously orthodox in some sort of religious tradition and have a little c conservative worldview that already have developed the infrastructure for gift giving that might lead to the expansion of the mission to educate people in a broader set of curriculum. So here at Ave Maria, we have a pretty strong liberal arts tradition already in place. I hope your listeners know about Grove City, which is an incredible school. Ciceronian Society that I'm the president of will hold a scholarly conference there in March. And the legendary Yeshiva, it's been a university for a long time, but has really started to open itself up to the country, provides that kind of education for Orthodox Jews. So you kind of cover the gambit of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews with this sort of development of a broader mission for these colleges, a broader mission that remains consistently religious according to their traditions, but also provides resources for students that have a broader interest than just the liberal arts tradition, or maybe for instance, at Ave Maria, there's a nursing school that's doing very well. And when I say all of this, the university that I have in mind, the university that's done this the best, has been Hillsdale. Hillsdale College has set its own way and has successfully fundraised in pursuit of that way. And there's no reason that other universities can't succeed the way Hillsdale has. And so they kind of prove that it can be done if the universities are willing to take on that initiative, and donors are willing to take the risk on donating to these schools in that pursuit.
Just as a follow-up question, because I was reading I don't know, a online, interview with that had Michael Anton in it, and his worry has always been when it comes to, I mean, he agrees that we should be funding and new universities, start getting into the culture once again, but he worries that that people like Peter Thiel or some of them would say, yeah, but this is just a waste of money. We should just not even try doing this because it's too much or whatever. What do you say to those people who are skeptical that someone like a Peter Thiel or some other conservative billionaire will go and say, I want to buy this, campus or whatever, and fund this so that, we can get back on track and do this the right way. What do you say to those people?
So, far be it from me to presume to know more than Peter Thiel about anything. But I'll do my best. But understand that I realize that I am clashing with Peter Thiel here, not just anybody. The issue with that position is that often what conservatives, I think, especially conservatives of a more economic leaning than say they're less focused on social questions, is that they tend to overemphasize the significance of money. Now, and I've talked a lot about very large sums of money, or what used to sound like large sums of money before this infrastructure stuff that we have going on in Congress. But the thing about money is that money actually has to translate into another currency that's extremely important and doesn't often make as much of an impact on the imaginations of conservative donors, which is prestige. And prestige is the primary product of elite institutions. And this is why often you'll have conservative donors, people who are on the right and have a lot of money. Often what they want is that strategy of counterattack, because their hope is that the counterattack will be sufficiently successful that they can kind of smuggle their kids into elite universities and have them come out the other end without being a Trotskyite, right? And what Peter Thiel is saying here is that often these institutions are not necessary for producing, say, something like a financial or economic benefit. But that's because the primary purpose of the university is not to do that, although maybe some engineering schools, like places like MIT or Caltech or University of Pittsburgh, are more focused on technological development that has some financial redounding. But rather what these universities are important for is developing prestige, and prestige that appends to ideas. And so the idea of critical race theory or diversity, equity, and inclusion, these are ideas that were fostered in prestigious institutions that then were imparted onto students that attended these universities and then implemented at companies or in NGOs or in governments, because this is how you are supposed to do things. And the way that you are supposed to do this is that there is a kind of elite marker in prestige that sanctions and legitimizes this approach. And so to back away from universities is to back away from bestowing prestige on important things. And there's no way to have a world in which prestige does not matter. There's not really an opportunity for us to go back and unfound Harvard, nor if if Harvard was never founded, there would probably be another one, right? Not just Yale, but like another place that would have been conferring prestige, because the purpose of the prestige there is really to grant legitimacy and And conservatives often have to deal with this problem in that their ideas are considered illegitimate or they're not prestigious. And so to halt them or to advance them is actually to kind of appear déclassé. And this way of thinking about culture and politics usually makes people on the right uncomfortable because they don't want it to come to this. Also, I'm sorry if that audio just came in just now. My email just made a noise.
So, I mean, you're fine. I think you're okay. I didn't hear anything, so we should be good. I was wondering, maybe the next question I had was, how can we be certain that these new institutions will be taken seriously? You mentioned, for example, the problem of accreditation. Are there other paths to irrelevance to be avoided, and how can we avoid those? In your vision of how you want this doll to play out.
Seth, you got the question I got the most. That's it. And to me, here's the thing: is like it's actually not. It's not certain. There's not a guarantee because there are no guarantees when it comes to administering institutions. I mentioned a couple times, I think, in my efforts to describe this, is that there's a certain level of risk in funding these institutions. They don't always succeed financially, and sometimes they may go astray. When I think of what used to be conservative, relatively straight and narrow, orthodox Christian organizations, for example, places like Baylor and Pepperdine and Wheaton, these are places that are kind of on the edge now. And a big reason for why they're on the edge is that as universities improve in public prestige, they often begin to look at different universities as peers. This is a little bit of pulling the curtain back in higher education, but part of strategizing the development of a university is identifying peer institutions. So, places like Notre Dame probably do not regard Georgetown as a peer institution, rather they regard Yale as a peer institution that they're trying to overtake, which means that their priorities will not be necessarily those of a traditional Catholic education. Although there's a fair amount of success in preventing Notre Dame from fully going down that path, it is a tendency of universities to peg their prestige or their excellence on what is at the top of the rankings list. So you're right. One of the things I talk about as a problem is accreditation, which is a hidden factor in pushing universities in that direction as well. Because for those who don't know it, listening, accreditation refers to the ability for the university to accept public funds, usually in the forms of student loans for the students to attend. And without that accreditation, universities do not have tuition as a basis for income. And this can be the death knell for a lot of places. And as accreditation's weaponized against conservative institutions, they need to be ready to have financial resources at their disposal to avoid being put out of business or forced into compliance against the mission of their college or the consciences of the founders and students there. So this means that there's an even greater necessity for funding these sort of conservative, countercultural, and often religious universities, because they may be facing a tough road to hoe in that respect. One final thing to note about preventing the universities from going astray would be to stipulate these things very clearly in gifts given to the university. Donor intent is a big deal when it comes to providing these grants, and I know that this has become a big part of the philanthropy world on the right, is ensuring that gifts are not just undermined in their original intent and instead are managed very carefully. So that would be something for folks to consider. But as for the prestige element, the way that prestige works is that over time, investment in the institutions, especially if the institutions place well in areas where high prestige can be found, eventually leads to things like prestige. So, for example, Ave Maria University has successfully placed people in like the American Enterprise Institute or in the staff of former President Donald Trump, people like former Vice President Pence and sitting Senator Marco Rubio. And being able to claim these things as what institutions like ours can do is a way of indicating that there's real benefit to people to come here. And when students who maybe are on the right think to themselves, exactly how would I be taken for working in these offices if I were at a more mainstream or left-wing institution? I'd probably be chased out. And the reason for that is that for a long time, mainstream universities understood that they had a benefit in at least tolerating strong conservative students, because they would bring access and prestige to people they may want to attract, like sitting senators to come visit the college, or even access to the White House if a Republican enters into office. But now they don't want that anymore. They'd rather not have access to the White House or access to Republicans to come speak at their schools, and only have access on the left. And so what offers institutions that are currently still doing more conservative education is an opportunity to take on elite students and reward them for pursuing high prestige positions and bolstering a sense of our own sort of countercultural elite. That way, the incentives of the institution are aligned with staying conservative more than drifting left, and that's the hope. But again, there's no guarantees, and in higher education, that's especially true.
So I think immediately when I read a piece like yours of a somewhat analogous situation, maybe 30 years ago, conservatives really found themselves shut out of another institution, namely the media. Everything from major newspapers to major magazines to prime time, just network television, even to cable news, was all center left. And there was a lot of work done to create alternative institutions in media. And now we see those they've really proliferated. And I think part of what I've seen is that it's easy to sort of, in the same way that people on the right will dismiss some of the so-called mainstream institutions and media as just being leftwardly biased. It's the same thing happens in reverse. Most people who are not conservative don't take conservative media super seriously. But the other thing that I see happening is just sort of these things become like their own silo, their own echo chamber, that sort of thing. Is that a danger for new, more conservative or traditional or Western civilization focused universities to become something that are kind of walled off and just their own world? And if so, is that a problem?
It is a danger and it is a problem. And it's one I think about a lot, because I went to the University of Virginia to do my PhD, and I had a professor. I actually had a couple professors who helped me through the process of writing my dissertation. A woman named Lori Balfour, and a man named Melvin Rogers. He's not at UVA anymore. He's at Brown. And they really challenged me. I'm very conservative, I guess, by their standards. And they challenged me to think about things I didn't necessarily know a whole lot about on questions of the civil rights movement, for example. And it was very productive for me, although I probably reached conclusions they don't agree with. At least being exposed to that level of disagreement was extremely important for my own intellectual development. And so that is the concern, is that you create kind of intellectual monocultures. And I would not want that for the universities that I'm describing here. And that might actually be a risk that these universities would become like this. The problem is that the range of options available to Americans right now is unfortunately not one that would be most optimal for intellectual diversity and garnering multiple perceptions, largely because it's being foreclosed. Administrators and sometimes fellow students, and to a lesser extent, their faculty at universities simply do not want this. And often faculty do not want this because they don't want to have their own jobs compromised, as we see numerous faculty, even on the left, get sort of hounded out of their own positions. So I would rather conservative institutions create a kind of internal diversity of thought, even if many of the professors themselves remain firmly on the right, at least attempt to expose students to the contrary positions so that they might refute them. And some degree of education in that respect would be very useful. But here's the issue that really worries me, and you didn't bring this up, but it's something to think about, which is that where are the conservative faculty for these universities going to come from? If graduate schools are no longer admitting conservatives, and in many cases they're not, and after all, they're not admitting conservatives because there's no conservative faculty to direct their research, then what this might mean is that there will be a smaller number of scholars who can actually train our university professors. And so the fear of a monoculture then becomes a little bit more distinct, because you might just be reproducing the intellectual ideas of only a handful of people who've been able to hang on for dear life in higher education. And so really the time it's not in the future. The time is now to start dealing with this while there's still some faculty at universities that have the resources to train graduate students to place in future conservative universities. But it's not ideal that conservative universities would be siloed off, but at least there can be an internal university ethos to provoke a diversity of thought. I know that in our department, politics here at Ave Maria, we do that a fair amount to the students. We try to provoke them into thinking about a diverse range of ideas, including left-wing ideas that we try to introduce, although we do so largely to teach the students about the problems with them. But we have progressive students on campus too, and they often appreciate the recognition and the back and forth, but it's all done in good faith and with the sense that no one's going to be canceled for having a disagreement.
So just to give you the last word, what should listeners' next step be? Is there something that they can do in sort of pushing this process ahead, or should they check some additional resources out to learn more about what's going on? What do you recommend?
Well, I really appreciate that question, because often I find that's the thing that people know the least about, is what exactly is the right call to make. The first thing is to go see what's going on at your university. If you graduated from college, and certainly not everyone listening to this probably graduated from college, that's fine. So you don't have to worry about this as much, but check to see, go beyond the alumni newsletter, go beyond what's posted online, and actually see what your departments are doing. You'll often be surprised. A joke I've had with a few people from one particular large Catholic university was, "Oh yeah, the Gothic architecture is for the magazine," right? It's like, is it like this sort of identity university has long since moved on from all this, and so often that kind of stuff is published in media that the university puts out, but not for alumni. So it's relatively easy to find things that may not be what you wish to fund through alumni donations, and to steer what you have as alumni donations towards institutions that more align with your values. And that can be hard to do. I used to donate to a university that I attended, and I don't now, because I think unfortunately they've had to compromise a little too much. I won't say which one that is, and so I feel bad about it. The next thing to consider is that rankings for colleges that you find in things like U.S. News and World Report rankings are not all that they appear. Often they're based around surveys of other members of faculty, and they are often talking up the institutions they attended. And so one thing for prospective college-aged students to consider, as well as their parents, is whether they're going to actually be taught by their professors. In many cases, large or prestigious universities do not have professors teaching students, they have graduate students teaching students, and you will not have as much exposure to faculty unless you were either in graduate school or a postdoc, especially true in engineering and the sciences. This is a real problem. And so often attending a highly prestigious university will not necessarily mean meeting the faculty that you wish to meet. Now, this is not always true, and so it's important to be careful about these sorts of things. But it's one of the reasons why you may want to consider a smaller liberal arts school that may not have access to all of the most cutting edge technology, but unless you want to go into cutting edge technology, you won't need it. And it might be better for those people to have relationships with actual faculty who might do hands-on training with them that graduate students simply do not have the time and sometimes really even the incentives to provide. So that would be, so essentially discount often the rankings in those catalogs. Finally, one of the places, and this is for religious listeners, one of the places where students often experience loss of faith is in college. And that's because up until college, they've had family, they've had friends, they've had congregations, maybe just a general sense of stability in their own lives that has facilitated a life of faith. And most universities do not have those structures in place. Rather, they have countervailing structures in place. I know that I've had more than a couple students transfer to Ave Maria because when they were facing the opportunity to go to another university, they received emails about how to engage in different forms of multiple partner sexual acts with a verified consent, and they were like, I do not want to attend a university where this is an issue that's, you know, a feature of an email before I've even shown up on campus. So if you're a parent or a student that takes your faith life seriously, it's important to consider universities that do the same. And I have found that this has been a competitive advantage for a lot of more conservative universities, is that insofar as they do take those things more seriously, students and parents respond favorably to it, as they've come to recognize that a lot of major universities today simply don't, even purportedly religious ones. So I could go on, but I understand that you guys don't have 4 or 5 hours for me to keep going on this subject, so I'll cut myself off there.
Well, I'll tell you for my part, I'm on this bandwagon of you know trying to form new universities.
Good.
I think this is something that I mean, I'm sorry to say, but a lot of these universities are too far gone. So I'm on the bandwagon. I know Cal is. Me and him talked about this a little bit, but the silos and being fearful that this will be just an explicitly conservative thing and which will turn off a lot of people. I think that is a danger there. But I say, where we are today is really just really bad, to the point where I think now is the time to start funding new universities. Whether that I loved your point about in the article or essay when you talk about buying a college campus, but it's a little cheaper and all that, but it's kind of accelerates and pushes us to start getting new universities that have this core belief in what liberal arts should be. So I'm really supportive of it. I'm hoping this is something that people will start looking into. So I'm all for it.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad to have at least one other person who thinks so.
Well, Dr. James Patterson, thank you so much for, first of all, for continuing to explore this question of what we do with higher education institutions, and for coming on to discuss it and answer our questions today.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me on. This is something I've been wanting to yell from the mountaintops for a long time, so I'm glad that it's caught on with a few people, and hopefully your listeners might end up agreeing with me. I know that it feels often like we're a little at a loss for options, but we're not.
For our listeners, please check out the article at Law and Liberty. And thank you so much for listening. Please leave us comments. Tell us your thoughts on this and other opportunities to engage that you see. And again, thank you, Dr. Patterson, for being on. For my co-host, Seth Root, this is Cal Davenport signing off from In the Trenches.